In this video, I will go through everything you need for glazing UV resin on polymer clay. This includes what you need for resining and why you need it, how to resin, and extra tips for using UV resin. So, let's get started. First and foremost, having UV resin is important, but which one is the best one to use? For resining polymer clay, I recommend a UV resin that's high viscosity and something that will cure fairly fast. A lot of other creators like to use J. Diction or Mr. Resin, but to be honest, I stick with a brand called Sana from Amazon since it cures quickly and is of high viscosity, meaning that it's not super runny at normal temperatures. By quickly, I mean 5 to 10 minutes, which is a lot faster compared to other resin brands. I would like to note though that depending on how you use resin, there might be something better. Since I'm only talking about coating polymer clay pieces, I gave my previous recommendations. If I were doing resin for something like dice molds or small silicone molds, I would choose a resin that is low viscosity. I actually use 2 different UV resin brands because of this. All in all, resin is very versatile and different brands suit different purposes. Just like there are different resin brands for different occasions, there are also different respirator masks for different purposes. When it comes to using a respirator mask, I recommend one that doesn't have a shield on the front of your face. This is because when you need to resin for a long period of time, the shield on the front can get condensation and it can be, well, pretty gross. Also, there were these things that would press on the temple of my head, and this would give me a really bad headache after a while. I recommend this respirator mask because it provides really ample protection but won't press on your temples, so you can wear it for a long period of time. However, if you want to be extra safe, I wouldn't rule out using safety goggles or even just glasses to keep your eyes safe from any resin splashes. You will also need to use a respirator that has 6001 organic vapor cartridges such as these. Something like the N95 mask or the pink vapor cartridges are unfortunately not enough to protect your body from resin vapor. There's also been some pretty bad stories about not using a mask when you resin, so I really emphasize this point of getting a proper and sufficient respirator mask for resining. The next thing you'll need to make sure of is that you either have an open window or you're outside in somewhere like an open garage when using your resin. These measures may seem excessive, but I've seen a lot of YouTube videos and Reddit stories of people not being careful with the fumes of resin, and it's really put me in this mindset of it's better safe than sorry. Even if you have a respirator on, it's still extremely important to have ventilation in your room and have something like a completely open window. Next thing on the list is plastic gloves. I recommend plastic ones instead of rubber gloves because when handling curing resin, using plastic gloves avoids leaving imprints on the finish. Sometimes, as much as you try to cure the resin, it's not quite finished yet. So using plastic gloves prevents leaving things like fingerprints on your pieces by accident or the gloves sticking to your pieces. Plastic gloves are also great protective equipment because you don't want to have uncured resin on your skin either. Another all-important thing you'll need is a UV lamp. A UV lamp helps to cure your UV resin quicker and give it that nice shiny finish we all know and love. I would recommend getting a UV lamp that can let you cure for as long as possible, and a lot of nail UV lamps can do this job well. I would also recommend that you get a UV lamp that can fit a lot of jewelry pieces in for curing, because you will be leaving your jewelry in the UV lamp for a while to cure. You would also need to press the curing button multiple times for your jewelry to actually finish curing properly. This is the UV lamp that I use, but I don't exactly love it, but it does the job. If I were to get another one, I would recommend getting one with a base so you wouldn't need to get a silicone mat separately for it. The next thing I suggest using is a brush to apply the UV resin to your polymer clay pieces. I recommend using a brush because it's the best way to control how much resin you put on your polymer clay pieces. This is important so you don't miss any spots on your polymer clay, and it's great for making sure you don't apply too much resin on a piece that has crevices where you want to accentuate the indents instead of covering them. The brush that I use is a mid-sized flat brush, and I highly recommend this type of brush as it covers everything evenly and it covers a lot of surface area at once. The next items I'm about to say might sound a little weird, but hear me out. I really think you should add clothing line pegs and blue tack to your shopping list if you want to use UV resin with your polymer clay. This is because this combination lets you hold the polymer clay piece with ease as you coat your piece with resin. I saw that a lot of people would just leave it on a mat and UV resin their piece, but I just found that this wasn't great for inspecting your polymer clay properly to make sure that all the piece was covered. Isopropyl alcohol, tissues, toothpicks, and cotton swabs is basically your cleanup crew for dealing with UV resin. While tissues can be for big accidents and spills, toothpicks and cotton swabs are great for cleaning more precise things like taking dirt off your polymer clay pieces or getting resin off a stud bag. I suggest to get alcohol for occasions you need to wipe UV resin off of a surface. Yes, just wiping off with tissue can be sufficient, but to make sure you've completely gotten rid of the UV resin, it's always best to follow up initially wiping the surface with a tissue that has alcohol on it. Alcohol is also recommended for cleaning your surface before using polymer clay and for wiping off paint, so it's a really great general purpose cleaner for your studio. I specifically use 99.9% isopropyl alcohol because I remember reading it from somewhere, and I also remember using this stuff when I was a printer and we regularly had to clean off acrylic paint. And I mean regularly clean off acrylic paint as in the surface had to be completely spotless in order for us to use it in the next job. It definitely has a strong smell to it, and you need to wear gloves when using this alcohol to prevent your skin from drying, but it's a fantastic way to clean your stuff. I've used this professionally, so I wouldn't really use anything else. I do know that other people just use rubbing alcohol, but yeah, at the end of the day, just use something you're comfortable with and that should do the job. This next thing can be viewed as optional, but not really, and that's something to heat up your resin, especially in the winter time. I say it's optional, but not really, because heating up your resin can make it way easier to work with. It can stop bubbles from forming, things like stretching, which is when the resin doesn't cure on the edges of your piece, and prevents it from just generally being hard to work with because the resin can be really unfluid to use when it's cold. I use a hand warmer to heat up my tub of UV resin and a hot water bottle to keep the tube of UV resin warm in the winter. To be honest, I was gifted these items, but if I were to choose, I would actually just use some sort of USB heating mat to keep the UV resin warm, since I need to charge my hand warmer when it runs out of battery. Also, it's not a flat surface, so I have had instances of my tub falling, and it really sucks and can waste quite a bit of resin. Apart from a USB heating mat, I've also seen people use a lighter to extinguish bubbles formed on UV resin. If you use a lighter, I would say just make sure you don't use it for too long, because I've also had instances where I kind of burnt my UV resin and it left a black residue on the finish. To start off, make sure some tissue, alcohol, cotton swabs, and toothpicks are in your vicinity. Also, begin to warm your UV resin up and wear your respirator as well as your plastic gloves. Also, make sure you pop your window open. Remember how you have blue tack and clothing line pegs? Well, this is when you use it. You'll need to roll your blue tack and stick it into your peg, then apply your clay piece on top. You really want to make sure that it's stuck firmly onto the blue tack to avoid making your polymer clay piece fly off when you are applying UV resin on it. To make sure it's stuck securely to the blue tack, I actually hold on to the polymer clay and wave it around a bit. If I feel it's securely on there, I go on to the next step. If not, I'll either push it down more firmly or reapply it again so I can really feel that it is securely on. When reapplying, you might need to start from the very beginning of rolling out your blue tack before putting it between the peg, but this combination helps a lot with controlling how you move your piece while you resin. So I don't mind this, even though it's a bit of a hassle. The next step is applying the resin. It's always good to apply a good amount of resin to make sure everything is covered and to avoid stretching. If your polymer clay piece has crevices though, you would want to apply a lot less UV resin to start with. This is because a lot of UV resin can level out your surface. This is great for if you want to cover a crack on your polymer clay pieces, but not what you want if you want to accentuate the shape of a polymer clay piece that has indents. For these pieces, you'd only want to add a little bit of resin at a time until you feel everything is covered. If you shine the resin off into a light, it's helpful to see what spots you may have missed. Therefore, I suggest using a good light source that you can shine on your resin so you can see if there were any spots that you missed. Next is curing the resin. Please note that depending on the manufacturer of your resin, this could be an extremely varied result, like completely different result. I know this because I consistently use 2 different UV resins, but for this case, I'll talk about using the UV resin that I use for coating my polymer clay pieces. Because I want to cure constantly and consistently, I paint one side of the UV polymer clay, put it in the UV lamp, and continue to press the curing button until I add my next resin piece, and then I sort of continue it down the line and continue to press the curing button. I shuffle my UV pieces down the line by order of the longest a resin piece has been under the UV lamp so that I don't have the mishap of taking one right after I placed it under there. Usually the polymer clay piece closest to me is the newest resin piece, and the ones that are outside cooling down are the ones that have been cured the most and are ready to be completed. I also basically keep the polymer clay piece in the UV lamp as much as I can until there isn't really space to keep it under there. I generally stick to 4 pieces. I tend to put UV resin on 6 pieces until I start to work on a new set. So this means 4 in the lamp for curing and 2 are out for cooling down before I flip it over on the other side or complete it. I let it cool down because 1, it can be really hot and you don't want to touch it that hot. And 2, letting it cool down also helps you to avoid touching it too early and touching it while it's still pretty tacky. So yeah, this is my process for resining my pieces because I like to try and do it continuously until all my pieces are done and have all had UV resin applied to them. Now, after you cure your UV resined polymer clay, you can now wait a little bit more before summing it into jewelry. I know that sounds anticlimactic, but even after you've cured it and the resin isn't tacky, it can still have this minuscule chance of sticking to stuff. For example, I've had instances where I've held my recently resined pieces and I don't leave any fingerprints or I don't feel any stickiness, but when I've laid it on top of another recently resined piece, they stick together. And when you take it off, it doesn't leave any marks on the UV resin layer, but you don't want your pieces sticking together, period. So in order to avoid this kind of stuff from happening, I usually leave it in a place where the pieces aren't crammed together, and I just leave it to sort of dry some more overnight. I only really assemble the jewelry the day after or a couple of days after I finished applying UV resin on them. So now here are my extra tips on how to make the best out of your UV resining sessions. My first tip is the other helpful accessories that you might consider getting to make it easier to use UV resin. The first thing I suggest is getting a silicone mat to put under your UV resin lamp if you don't purchase a UV lamp that doesn't have a base. This is because if there is any UV resin that drips on your desk and you cure it, well, good luck with taking that resin off your desk. It's easier to take off if it was a glass desk, but everything else would be a lot more difficult. Another thing that I would recommend is getting these small reusable tubs to put your UV resin in. This is because if you use any excess UV resin, you can always put it back. You may also want to store excess resin that you've colored and would like to reuse again. It's important that if you use these tubs, light will not be able to enter through it. You can buy a black tub or use gaffer tape, which is what I do to avoid getting any light exposure into the tub. Plus, gaffer tape is white on the inside, so you can properly see what color your UV resin is. I say this because I used to use black acrylic paint to stop light from coming inside, and this wasn't great because 1, the acrylic paint would easily chip off, and 2, I couldn't really see the difference between my clear UV resin and my black colored UV resin, so yeah. Also, maybe it's a good idea to label your resin tubs. Another helpful accessory I like to use is something like a container or a plastic dish to put my resin pieces in for organizational purposes. For example, I use this container for putting in my polymer clay pieces and my assembled jewelry, and I use these dishes for when I'm leaving my UV resin polymer clay pieces to cure some more overnight. I especially like using these plastic dishes because I can give the newly resined pieces space to breathe and stop them from sticking together. To store UV resin, it's best to keep it out of sunlight and in a shaded place, even with its original container. If you don't cover your resin with something that's not see-through, if you store it in a place that doesn't reach sunlight, the resin will not stiffen up. Regardless, it's always better to be safe than sorry, which is why I make sure I keep my UV resin not only in opaque containers, but also in a place that doesn't reach sunlight. So I keep my UV tub in a drawer under my desk and the original UV resin container out of direct sunlight. As I've previously said, I use tissue, cotton swabs, and toothpicks to clean up my accidental UV resin spills. What I'm about to say might sound crazy, but after using these tissues and cotton swabs, I also cure them before putting them into the bin. Now, I do this specifically because since UV resin fumes are the most dangerous thing about using it, I want to doubly make sure UV resin fumes aren't just chilling in the air or something from the rubbish bin. So I will cure tissue and cotton swabs on the other side of me curing my UV resin jewelry. I know that sounds so stupid, but at the same time, I'd rather be safe than sorry, you know? You can completely ignore this, but I thought regardless, it would be good to let you know. Now, how to take care of your resin brush. I either do two things with the resin brush. Say I want to take a break or something, I'll wrap it in a piece of paper, peg it, then put it somewhere far away from sunlight like the drawer under my desk. After a big resining session, or should I want to use the brush for something else, I will clean it off completely using an alcohol solution and dry it in tissue to make sure all the resin is off. However, I know that some people just prefer storing the brush somewhere dark until the next time they want to use it, so feel free to do that if you want. I wrote this point in caps, so this is a pretty important one. I feel like this can be easier said than done, but for me, a good example of needing to avoid the sunlight was when I was resining directly in front of my window. Now, I thought this was a great idea because I thought I could have gotten away with not wearing a mask. However, this made me feel pretty dizzy after a while, and it ended up slowly stiffing up my brush to the point I couldn't recover it, even after cleaning it with alcohol. I know that curing resin quicker can be a big issue, but it's always better to avoid sunlight so you can better control when your resin UV cures. I know that some brands like what I use may cure faster than others, but like I've previously said, it's always better to be safe than sorry. I would only recommend you expose sunlight to your UV resin pieces only after you've cured them through the lamp and you're leaving it out to naturally cure some more overnight. And there are all my tips on how to use UV resin with polymer clay. I hope this helped you, or if you want to ask any questions, let me know in the comments down below. If you want more content like this, feel free to like this video and subscribe. In the meantime, good luck with your UV resining, and I hope you stay safe. Have a nice day.